Okay, welcome everyone to this month's Fellowship for Intentional Community member webinar. We're happy that you could join us, and also greetings to everybody who is watching this later on in recorded form. So my name is Makin Ludwig, and I'm going to be the host for today's webinar because our usual host, Sky Blue, is actually our presenter today. So I'm going to take on being the logistics person for this particular webinar. So speaking of logistics, I just want to go over a couple things about how we're going to do today's webinar. So if you haven't found it yet, there is a chat function. If you scroll down to the bottom of your screen, you should be able to get to the chat, and you can type messages in that chat that everyone can see, or you can just chat something to me. And so I would say if you are having any kind of logistical problems or technical problems, I can't promise that I will know how to fix it, but I will do my best to try. So go ahead and chat those directly to me. And then you all can engage in conversation if you want with each other over in the chat area just by sending your message to everyone. And we're going to use that and the Q&A box that you should also be able to access. And if you're having trouble finding those, just let me know. But you can type questions into the open tab on the Q&A box, or you can type stuff into the chat that everybody will see. And basically, I'm only going to look at the questions that look like they're super important for us to get answered right now during Sky's original presentation. So he's going to present for probably about a half an hour. And during that time, we're going to really keep it as just presentation unless there's something urgent that is presenting itself in the Q&A box. And then after that, we'll open it up, and we'll be able to, once Sky is done with his presentation, actually give you the mic and have you show on the screen, just like Sky and I are showing up on the screen right now. But we won't actually open up that function until after Sky is done with the main presentation. So go ahead and type stuff into the chat and the Q&A at any point, and I'll open it up for more live interaction once Sky is done with his presentation. So that's our logistics. And this is being recorded so that folks can look at it later, and you'll get a copy of that recording after we're done with today's session. Any other logistics, Guy, that I should say, or got
Sounds good?
Okay, great. Again, I'm Makin Ludwig. I'm a board member of the Fellowship for Intentional Community, which is the organization hosting this webinar. And I am delighted today that we have Sky Blue, our executive director, who's going to be presenting. And Sky is someone who's brought a lot of really terrific new energy into the Fellowship for Intentional Community over the last couple of years. And so I'm delighted to give him the floor for him to be able to present today. Sky, it is yours.
Awesome, thank you. So hi everyone, as mentioned, my name is Sky Blue. Yes, that is my real name, and yes, my parents were hippies. And I am the executive director of the Fellowship for Intentional Community. This webinar, the title is Making It Happen Cooperatively. So this is going to be a nuts and bolts focused presentation that we are going to do some theory in advance. To start off though, let me just give you a little bit more about who I am. So I have lived a lot of years, I guess 13 in total now, at Twin Oaks Community, which is a now 50-year-old intentional community in Central Virginia, income sharing 100-person community. And it is actually also where my parents met, though I was not born or raised there, but I do have my roots there. Over the years, living at Twin Oaks and then also living at a few other intentional communities for shorter periods of time, I have been involved with the FIC as well as the Federation of Egalitarian Communities, which is a small network of communities that Twin Oaks is a part of that are all income sharing communities. And then through working with the FIC, I've been having more contact and working with the Global Eco-Village Network, and particularly FIC being part of the North American representation to the Global Eco-Village Network. So, while FIC is sort of has more of a US North American focus, while also including communities around the world, Jen very explicitly has a global focus, and we're really happy to have a relationship with them to be able to bridge those worlds. Also really important out there is the Co-Housing Association of the US that the FIC enjoys a close working relationship with. And, you know, again, I have this sort of family history with intentional communities. My father helped start a co-housing community in Chico, California, and it was one of my early experiences living in intentional community. There's also the North American Students of Cooperation, primarily student housing co-ops out there. And I also lived in a student housing co-op for a little while during college. So, you know, the sort of variety and diversity of models that are part of this movement has always been you know, something I've been aware of and has seemed like a really important thing to me. In addition to that, there's also, you know, other sort of allied organizations and movements that the FIC tries to maintain connection with, and that we sort of see ourselves as being part of a larger movement of movements. So worker cooperatives, permaculture, transition towns, all these different kinds of organizations that are closely values aligned. You know, ultimately we're all kind of working towards the same vision of the world that we want to be creating, just in these different forms. Along those lines, FIC is also a member of the New Economy Coalition, which is a really amazing platform organization for kind of connection and collaboration amongst a wide range of different kinds of organizations, cooperative businesses, political organizations, nonprofits, again, all sort of working towards what does a truly cooperative, democratic, economic, political, social system in the world look like. So FIC is definitely happy to be a member of that. Yeah, and just, you know, continuing to try and do the work of bringing together different organizations in this country to support intentional communities on the ground that are trying to form or have formed and are struggling, or just trying to take things to the next level in different ways. So, you know, a little bit about me in bigger picture. I'm just, so let's see, moving on. Let's just kind of get into it here. I am going to now share my screen so that you can sort of follow along in some of my notes. If I can find this, bear with me for a second. Mike, are you seeing a Google Doc that says Meta Framework kind of at the top?
Nope, I'm seeing your inbox.
No, that's not what you're supposed to be seeing. Let me do this a slightly different way. Sorry for the technical difficulties here. How about now?
There you go. Meta framework?
Yep.
Yep.
Great.
We're good.
So, so a couple of years ago, the FIC, as an organization, decided that we wanted to identify a few core values that we hold as an organization. You know, all of the communities that are listed in the directory or that utilize our services in different way don't necessarily hold these values either in these terms or in a related way, and we're okay with that. You know, we're okay with lots of different kinds of groups being you know, listed in the directory and making use of our services. But as an organization, we wanted to say there are certain things that we hold and believe, and that we want to be expressing in the world through this movement building work that we're doing. So the first one that we identify is cooperation, and I'm sort of throwing in interdependence as another framing for that. But the basic idea here is that we're all in this together, and whether we're talking about that as individual communities or humanity, global society as a whole, that is a central idea of what we're working on here. We're all responsible for each other. We're working together to make the world work for everyone. There's, you know, very specific stuff that goes into this, especially around decision making and governance. That is a big part of what intentional communities are doing. How do we actually make genuinely cooperative, democratic decisions together amongst you know, small and large groups of people? Social justice, economic justice, racial justice. This is a big thing. This was a big step for the FIC to really say, yes, we're on board with this. We want to support this. We want to figure out how to represent this, manifest this in the world. What does social justice mean has been a big question for us for a while. One of the basic sort of dictionary definitions that I've been appreciating is just that social justice is about the fair and reasonable distribution of wealth, opportunities, and privileges in a society. A lot of how I think about this is that, ideally, everybody in the world has the same access to resources and decision-making based on sustainable use, proportional to need, but that nobody's access to resources and the decision-making about those resources is greater or comes at the expense of other people's access. So this is, and again, so how does this represent itself in intentional communities, especially around issues of race and class and these sort of diversity issues? How do we address privilege? How do we address oppression, both systemically in the world and then also internal to our communities and internal to ourselves? And I think, what the FIC is seeing is that intentional communities have a real opportunity here to do that bridge work around how do we address this within ourselves? How does it show up in our communities, and how do we address that? And then how can our communities play a role in addressing the larger systemic issues around privilege and oppression and exploitation? And then lastly, sustainability, which, there's a lot of sort of buzzword terminology sort of stuff that we always have to be aware of here. Regenerative is sort of a hot term these days. Sustainability is a little bit less in vogue. And we continue to sort of play with what these mean. But when we're looking at these terms, some of the basic ideas here are, that we're talking about, human activities, humans, societies that are harmlessly integrated with the natural world and continuable into the indefinite future. And that also kind of looking more from the sort of regenerative side of it. We're not talking about sustaining the mess that we've created. We're also looking at really how do we heal the damage we've done to the earth, to society, to ourselves. And again, what role can intentional communities play in this? So I'm running through some of this theory stuff in part because it's hard to explain what it's like to live in an intentional community to people who have no frame of reference. A lot of people have something. I mean, you can kind of talk about churches, you can talk about living in dorms in college, things that kind of get at some of the basic essence of the experience. But there's something there that is hard to get across, and I think part of the role of that the FIC is playing is like, how do we explain that? How do we try to get this across, what it's like, what the benefits are, that sort of thing. So that's a big part of what this is about. And just that we're continuing to clarify what our understanding of this thing that we're doing is, and how we are then expressing it out into the world. And a lot for me, the questions around this has been around relevance and applicability. If we are really trying to be models for society, if we're saying, we have this fundamental critique of society, we see some structural fundamental problems with how society is built, how it is operating, and we have a different vision for how we think society could look, and how do we address those kinds of problems, then and intentional communities are sort of the way that we express that. Well, how is that actually relevant and applicable to the world as a whole? Actually starting to articulate that, so that we could start to look at, like, what are the basic principles that intentional communities are trying to capture, and then what would it look like for a city, for a state, for a country, for the whole world to be structured based on those same values. To do a little bit on definitions, so when we're talking about intentional communities, we very much use intentional community as a broad umbrella term. That is a way, we use it in a way that it helps us know who we're serving, as opposed to being a particularly sort of rigid term that we need groups to adopt, or that sort of thing. Many groups that we might identify as intentional communities are not, don't choose to use that term, and that's fine. It's more just a sort of method for us to be able to identify who it is that we're trying to serve. But, you know, you've got eco-villages, you've got co-housing communities, you got housing co-ops, communes, that term is still to some extent in use, co-living, co-householding. There's sort of different models, terms that kind of keep popping up. And it's interesting to keep sort of looking at how these terms and definitions evolve. But right now, the FIC defines an intentional community as a group of people who live together or who share common facilities and who regularly associate with each other on the basis of explicit common values. So, you know, breaking that down a little bit, you've got a group of people who live together or share common facilities. You know, we're kind of looking in the realm of, like, you know, people do you know, neighborhood tool libraries, car co-ops, these sorts of things, ways that they are sort of tying themselves together in some physical, tangible way for mutual support and benefit, and who regularly associate on the basis of explicit common values. So this is where the intentional part of this starts to come in. They are coming together in an intentional way around some explicit set of common values. The definition, the current definition that the Global Eco-Village Network is using for eco-village, I think is interesting to look at: consciously designed through locally owned participatory processes in all 4 dimensions of sustainability: social, cultural, ecological, and economic, to regenerate their social and natural environment. So again, kind of getting back to this regenerative idea, sustainability, but really looking at it in a holistic way. I think, you know, all these different models and what they're working on, there is a sort of core idea here of there's a sort of holistic approach that's being taken here. And I think one of the kind of core ideas around intentional communities is this idea that there are systemic problems in the world, and intentional communities are offering a look at what a holistic solution to those systemic problems looks like. You know, so there's the whole movement of cooperatives out there as well, which is also an international movement. There are lots of different kinds of cooperatives, from consumer co-ops like food co-ops, utility co-ops like electrical co-ops, producer co-ops like agricultural co-ops, worker co-ops, housing co-ops. Credit unions are actually co-ops. They're actually cooperatives. There is a certain irony in the fact that, at least a number of years ago, what I remember hearing is that the Navy Federal Credit Union was actually the biggest cooperative in the country. Credit unions often don't realize that they're cooperatives or have an identity as such, but there's some interesting work in different areas of the country to try and bridge these different kinds of cooperative business and create more mutual support. And I think intentional communities are you know, a natural sort of part of that. I mean, many people who might live in an intentional community might also be part of some kind of worker cooperative, at least in an urban sort of setting. And these things obviously make sense. Again, we're all kind of working towards the same thing here. You know, kind of general definition here around collectives: a group of entities that share or are motivated by at least one common issue or interest, or work together to achieve a common objective. So again, I'm just trying to get at some of the basic underlying ideas of what is it that we're talking about here, because that definitely matters in terms of then the kinds of programs and services that we want to be providing to support people. Some basic thoughts here on why do they matter, and I would say that, you know, a lot of people will sum up it in one word, which is sharing. At a recent FIC meeting, we talked about how a big part of what intentional community is about is sharing. Again, there's the social aspects, the economic aspects, cultural, ecological, and that these are all totally intertwined. You can't really separate them from each other in this idea of sharing in community, and that there's sort of a call here in terms of, you know, having good relationships with each other, making a more economically feasible existence, having an ecologically sustainable presence on the planet, that sharing is the key. And that the call here is to share as much as you can and then share some more. So sharing, key there. Collective self-determinism is sort of a, idea I've been sort of throwing around, this idea that, when we're looking at, particularly when we're looking about at ownership, that we're shifting the notion of ownership to being about access as opposed to control, and that you have groups of people who are collectively responsible for the decision making about the conditions of their lives, and that this, obviously scales up, and that ideally, in the world, we're empowering people on ever increasingly larger scales to be part of the decision making over the circumstances of their lives, equal access to resources and decision making. So, I mean, what does that look like? You might know what you have an idea about. You have a 20-person collective house. What does that look like? But then, what does it look like for an entire country? Again, to be based on the idea that that everybody who is affected by decisions has a part as sort of an empowered player in helping make those decisions. So these are big ideas, but again, I'm trying to connect what our intentional community is working on and how does that actually relate to society as a whole. Last thing I'll just throw in there is nonviolent conflict resolution. I mean, to some extent, we kind of take this for granted, but I remember a long time ago when I was a new member at Twin Oaks, more sort of long-term communitarian, they're talking about, here we are, a bunch of people sharing a finite amount of resources and trying to figure out how to make decisions about that without killing each other. I mean, and on some level, isn't this what humanity is trying to learn? We've got this finite planet. We've got all these people on it. How do we make decisions about how those resources are distributed sustainably, fairly, without resorting to violent conflict over it? So that's kind of the theory sort of end of things that I want to give to you right now. They're looking more at sort of nuts and bolts aspects of things. When we're looking at what is a sort of framework for success, there's sort of some basic ideas here that I want to throw out. It's a little old now, but so one of the best resources we have available for creating intentional communities is a book called Creating a Life Together by Diana Leaf Christian, which is available on the bookstore and ic.org. But she did an extensive amount of surveying of different communities, and she came up with a number that 90% of communities fail. So obviously the question is why? She offers some ideas in there, and there's a lot of different potential answers to that question. One thing that I'll suggest is that the number one thing that people don't realize in trying to start an intentional community is how big of a job it is, like how much it's going to take from you on all levels, logistically, financially, interpersonally, personally, just everything. I mean, like to some extent, when you're coming together with a group of people to start an intentional community, it's like a marriage or it's like having a baby. There's just so many different ways that you can't know how it's going to go, that you have to be prepared for, at least on the level of being up for whatever gets thrown at you. There's a lot of discussion these days around like what do replicable models look like? Like how do we scale? How do we replicate? And I think there's some useful discussion to be had there in terms of really looking at guidance, looking at best practices, from the experience that the decades worth of experience that intentional communities have to offer. But on some level, I think we haven't really found the replicable models yet, in part because none of them are really replicating yet. I mean, there are some interesting examples, and I think in particular, when you start to look at either more religious based communities or more service based communities, like Catholic worker communities, there's a whole lot of them all over the place, or the Camp Hill communities that are all communities geared towards supporting people with adults with developmental disabilities. So it's kind of interesting to me to look at that the communities that have some of the most coherence around particular vision, mission, values sort of stuff are the ones that actually have figured out how to replicate themselves the best. But we have very few examples of like really successfully replicated models, and I think we're still figuring that out. Like there's still just a tremendous amount of trial and error in creating intentional communities and figuring out what works, what doesn't, documenting it and putting it out there. Somebody said recently that an old saying is if you're not going to be a good example, be a stark warning, something along those lines. So even in our failures, there's wisdom to be shared. Let's see, kind of. Sometimes, you know, when I try and think about like, well, what are some of the key aspects needed for creating intentional communities? One of the things that comes up most is good-natured flexibility. You know, there's the idea of being committed to something but not attached to the particular outcome or way it looks, and there, you know, just the idea that we might be happy with things that we didn't initially think of ourselves or think that we would be happy with. In terms of, you know, starting a community, you know, I've come to the opinion, and lots of people have their takes on this, but I've come to the opinion that you should start with at least 5 people. If I'm putting it in a slightly cynical perspective, I would say, you know, if you can't reconcile your vision of a community with at least 4 other people, then that's kind of saying something. And that, you know, that if what we're going for is to really create these communities, you know, ideally that are going to outlive us. You know, I think that's what we're going for here. That it really should come from a synthesis of visions. Last thing I'll just mention here is that as a sort of guiding principle, I would say is just being very clear about what you want to do and what kind of community you're trying to create, both with yourself. I mean, being super honest with yourself about what is it that you really want, and then with others that you want to work with, and then expressing that to the world as a whole. I think in a lot of the things I'm going to touch on here, clarity is a key aspect. All right, so what are the top 3 things that you need to be aware of when working on starting a community? I would say it's purpose, relationships, and finances. So when we're talking about purpose, we're talking about vision, we're talking about mission, aims, goals, these sorts of things get thrown as well. What are your ideals? What are your values, intentions, practices? What are your core values? What do they mean? This is an important ongoing conversation. Like, what do our values mean? How are we reflecting them? How are we manifesting them? And continuing to be in a process of reevaluation around that. And again, it can kind of be anything. You just want to be clear about it, because that has super important implications for how you express yourself, and then who it is that you're then attracting, and then the sort of path the community takes from there. You know, many communities really, what they're about is trying to create a good life for their members. And that's fine. You know, there's certainly something to be said for having a larger mission in the world that your community is trying to express. But that's not. But if what you're trying to do is create a good community for the people who live there, that's great. Just be clear about that, and make sure that that's what you're putting out. Relationships. So it's a big topic, but you know, certainly conflict resolution is in there, and I would say that any community should be getting real clear, real fast in their forming process, or if they're formed and haven't already, on looking at what their conflict resolution processes are. You know, obviously related to that is sort of your communication in general, which helps to be able to identify and address when conflicts do arise. But then of course around that is the whole larger realm of how are you doing governance, management, decision making for your community. Obviously, these things vary a lot depending on how big your community is, how many people live there, what the level of financial or economic entwinement you have with each other as members are. But these are all important things that need to be really looked at. Membership is another key bit of this. And like I said, this is sort of a important connection to the purpose idea, is that you want to be clear about what your purpose is, because you want to be attracting members who get what that purpose is and are coming in ready to help make that purpose into reality. A lack of clarity of vision, and then having people move in, and then a body of members who are not on the same page about what they're working towards can create a lot of problems in a community. So, but with all of that clear vision, governance, decision-making sort of stuff, there's also just the social hygiene aspect, the community glue, the cultural side of things, like what brings you together, how do you enjoy each other, that sort of thing. But then also, like, how do you do sort of preventative work? How you're building the relationships, you're creating trust, you're building intimacy, so that when conflicts inevitably arise, that you've got more of a foundation for dealing with it. And that ideally also that you're building in some ways of helping things surface before they're major problems as well. In relationships, there's definitely, I would say, the personal growth, there's a personal growth aspect. And I think this is key from the perspective that so much of what we're trying to do in intentional communities is antithetical to what most of us have learned growing up in society. So there are so many things that we need to learn living in intentional community or starting them, and there's so many things we need to unlearn as well, and bringing that self-awareness, cultivating that self-awareness, so that we can identify the things that are not actually serving us or the people we live with, and that are getting in the way of doing this community thing that we're trying to do, is really important. And that, in general, again, with relationships, we're talking about this in a very sort of scaled, holistic sort of way. We're talking about your relationship to yourself, to your intimates, family, community, society, the world as a whole, and how do they all interact with each other? How does the choices that you make in the community that you live affect the choices that you make, affect the world as a whole, not just the people you live with? Last chunk of stuff here. So finances, it's tough. I think that's, if we can kind of sum that up, we can say finances are hard. We do not live in a very friendly financial world. It is not geared towards doing these intentional community things. Lots of communities out there have had success. Are obviously many have started and formed, and they have existed for, in some cases, decades. And so there's, again, definitely lots of wisdom that can be learned there. But it, cannot underestimate how challenging it is to both find the startup capital necessary to start an intentional community, but then also making sure that you have clear, viable and sufficient income sources on an ongoing basis. So, the way some communities have sort of solved this problem is by starting community businesses that are actually owned by people in the communities. This is definitely a slightly more common thing amongst the small set of income sharing communities that are out there, but there are definitely other communities have done it as well. Retreat centers or educational institutes, or that sort of thing are not that uncommon these days. So, but finding some way, especially if it can be values aligned, that your community as a whole can come together to make money, can be a really beneficial thing. It can also be a lot. There are definitely some people who are like, start a business, start a community, don't do them both at the same time, or start with one or start with the other. I'm kind of a whatever works sort of perspective around this sort of thing. If you've got the opportunities, go for it if you think you can, you know, pull it all off. But again, however you're doing it, you know, making sure you've A, got the startup capital, and then B, you know where your income is going to come from. If it's based on individual contributions, people buying in, people paying membership dues, fees, that sort of thing, how are your members able to make money? I mean, obviously, if you're in an urban setting, this is a lot easier than if you're in a rural setting, in which case it can be really hard, especially depending on the ability of people to telecommute, or whether or not they have skills that are actually marketable in the area that you're in. But so these are all things that like really need to be considered. And really, I mean, I would say that any intentional community in some ways should think of itself as a business and look at writing a business plan. There's a particular resource that unexpectedly I like to recommend, which is an organization called the Service Corps of Retired Executives. And there's a national organization with chapters all over the place and a whole online service. And they offer free business counseling to people trying to start businesses, and often offer very cheap series of business seminars for people. And you know, so this is something I did at some point because I wanted to know how to play the game, and learning how to write a business plan and really think through your income, your expenses, how is this all going to work? You know, whether you're really doing it as a business or as an intentional community is really valuable things to do. It's not, all this financial stuff is not why most of us want to live in community, but it is a reality of the world we live in. And so being able to be competent at it is really important. I think internal to the community, sort of the emphasis on transparent and democratic financial management is really important, like really setting yourself up well for everybody having an understanding of what's going on with the finances, and everybody feeling empowered in the management of that. We have just so much baggage around money that if you don't do that, it's one of the quickest ways to create conflict. Yeah, so I mean, and again, like I was saying, it's, you know, money is this pervasive and unavoidable consuming part of our lives, and such a source of stress. You know, and I see intentional communities have this potential to provide a lot of mutual support, or be a platform for people to reduce the amount of stress that they're dealing with this, and but you've got to navigate the finances of starting the community and making it viable for yourself as well. And again, I think it just can't be underestimated. As a last little bit before we kind of go into Q&A, I wanted to sort of throw out a few other frameworks. So the Federation of Egalitarian Communities, they all operate under a set of 7 principles. The top two, the first two that I think are really important are hold land, labor, income, and other resources in common, and assume responsibility for the needs of their members, receiving the products of their labor and distributing these and all other goods equally or according to need. You know, again, I think this really speaks to some of the core to whether a community is income sharing or not, the degree to which they are sharing expenses or not, but you know, that they are mostly about, there's generally speaking, we're talking about situations where there is some significant shared ownership of land, of facilities that everyone is sharing in this way to create community, to get social benefit, to get economic benefit, all these sorts of things. So like, I think all intentional communities are in some way, shape, or form kind of speaking to this aspect of taking responsibility for each other and sharing in that responsibility of meeting all of our needs together. So Diana Leaf Christian that I mentioned earlier, she's got a whole donut thing that she likes to talk about. There's 3 big aspects of healthy, thriving community she talks about: effective project management, creating community glue, and good process and communication skills, with the central donut hole which is the foundation being effective governance and decision making. So that's one way of looking at it. Cassandra Ferreira, who actually did one of our webinars a month or two ago, she works in the field of cooperative real estate. She looks at, when she's working with people, she looks at this sort of confluence of vision, people, land, money, and agreements, and how do all of these things interrelate with each other, and sort of using each one as a lens for looking at the other, and asking yourself questions about how you want to form your community. So that's the presentation. That's the information I wanted to throw at all of you. At this point, we can kind of go into a Q&A. I'm happy to do some troubleshooting with folks. I'm curious to hear what you're dealing with or what your particular questions are, and what ideas we might have to help.
Okay, Sky, thank you so much. That was great. It felt to me like it was both a sort of overview of the community's movement and also kind of an underview in a way, like sort of these are the underpinnings of what this movement is about and also what our relevancy is in the wider world. So I'm appreciating both of those levels of what you just presented. I can also add one piece to what you were saying, which is, so last year, Zach Rubin and Don Willis of the University of Missouri and I did a big survey study of existing intentional communities. And we were really surprised that, part of what we were looking at was what creates satisfaction, because we think that that's going to lead to longevity in communities. And we still have to unpack the data a lot. But the three things that were the strongest indicators, had the strongest relationship to satisfaction in community life were, interestingly enough, income sharing was the number one of those. And then the second one was having egalitarian relationships, and obviously income sharing has a relationship to that. And then the third one was mandatory conflict resolution. The groups that actually require people to build those skills and deal with their stuff with each other actually report a higher level of satisfaction. So I think that dovetails nicely with a chunk of what you were saying.
Yeah.
Yeah, so let's take a peek. So I'm not actually seeing anything in either the chat or the Q&A at this point in terms of questions. So if folks have questions, you can go ahead and put those into either one of those places. And we'd be happy to open up some conversation with Sky here. You were just so brilliant. Everyone's still going, I wonder if these functions are working. Oh, there we go. Okay, so Marty Campbell, hi Marty, asks, may we have file copies of your notes? Is that a shareable document, Sky?
Yeah, I will create a version of this that will, and there'll be a link to it in the follow-up email that goes out about this webinar.
Okay, great. Good. It also occurs to me that we could say, and I promise Sky didn't put me up to this, but FIC actually has a crowdfunding campaign going right now because we have 4 books that are going to be produced over the course of this next year. And the first one is Starting Community. And what these 4 are they're collections of what we think are the best and most useful Communities Magazine articles from the whole history of Communities Magazine. And so there's one on starting communities and then one about communication in community that I think both of those would be really helpful. And I can go looking before we close out and put into the chat a link to that crowdfunding campaign. So if folks are interested in learning more, there's, I think, about 300 pages of text for each one of those books. So they're going to be really meaty documents for folks that are interested, if you're interested in community, starting communities.
Here, actually, I've got the link to the crowdfunding campaign.
Okay, great. Okay, so comment from David Daly says, I believe communities would benefit when all individuals agree to take responsibility for their behaviors and actions. Thoughts on that, Sky?
Yeah, I mean, this touches on a couple things. Again, the sort of the clarity piece. that I put out before. I mean, I think, when sometimes people ask, what's the best decision-making method or what's the best conflict resolution method? And my answer these days tends to be, it's the one that everybody agrees to use. It's the one that everybody in the group says, yeah, let's do that. And it's the one that then they are invested in and that they are willing to be responsible for and accountable to in the process of utilizing it as a group. And so I think that is key. I mean, I think the basic ideas here around around accountability, around integrity, around responsibility, and the communication necessary for all of that, is absolutely really key stuff here. And again, I think of intentional communities as being the place where we're ideally practicing a lot of this stuff that then kind of we carry out into the world as a whole, or our modeling for the world as a whole.
Great. So Tim Rivers Garrett is asking, he says, we're interested in starting some business together in our existing community, perhaps a cider brewery. Do you have thoughts?
Cider Brewery sounds cool.
Awesome.
Yeah, I mean, I think, when you're looking at businesses, I mean, I definitely highly recommend looking at the worker co-op world for resources, whether or not you're exactly using that structure or not. But if there's any amount of kind of collectivity to the business that you're planning, I would recommend looking there if it is any kind of community-based endeavor. So there's the U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives, and then there is an affiliated organization called the Democracy at Work Network, which is a peer counseling consultancy resource group for, again, particularly, their focus is on worker cooperatives, but lots of stuff very relevant to other stuff as well. And then again, I mean, look outside the box in terms of resources that are available in your local area. Look for the local small business support organizations that are often actually government funded to some degree or another. There can actually be a lot of resources available. When I lived for a number of years in Charlottesville, Virginia, and helped start a couple small cooperative businesses as the part of the sort of larger urban community building work I was doing there. And we actually got a grant from a local small business organization. Basically, they paid a professional marketer to work with us for some number of hours as a startup company. So definitely, I would look for that. The other thing that I think a lot of people who start businesses, one of the problems they run into is they try and start too small, and there, unfortunately, there is just sort of an economy of scale thing that we have to deal with in the way the financial world is built, and if you don't try and start in a way that actually allows you to make the kind of money that you need to make it a viable income source for the people who are doing the work, then it's just not going to work. But usual stuff around like what are the resources in your area, what are the needs, that sort of stuff.
Okay, Steve Adiger, I hope I'm getting your last name right, Steve. I'm sorry if I'm not. He says, I live in a community that is 50 years old and has gone through many changes. It started as a commune and at one point had hundreds of members living in Chicago and houses throughout the US, as well as projects in 40 countries in the world. We're currently very loosely organized as the institute that owns our building has taken over the leasing of rooms. It's good to hear your wisdom about essential tenets of successful communities and gives me hope and ideas about where we could go next.
Well, great. I'm glad to hear that. I'm curious what your ideas about where to go next are.
What did this spark?
Yeah. I mean, it's the legacy, the communities sort of often have a lot of stuff to deal with. I mean, there's one of the most famous intentional communities, of course, is the farm in Tennessee, and they went through a massive changeover in the 80s from being a pretty much completely communal economy to essentially privatizing a lot of the houses and businesses and requiring individual financial contributions. So massive shift in their whole financial economic picture, and they lost like something like 90% of their members in the process of that. but and they also had some external pressure in terms of being sort of not exactly redlined, but basically the local financial institutions refusing to work with them, and other sort of local pressures. But they made it work. But lots of older communities. Heathcote in Maryland is another one that's gone, a really old one that's gone through a lot of changes over the years. I think for anybody living in a long-term established community, looking at other ones, Koinonia down in Georgia, which is celebrating its 75th anniversary this year. Silo, which is in one of the Carolinas, which is also was started back in 1949, one of the original intentional communities. But yeah, there's a lot of old school intentional communities out there that we can learn from.
Okay, great. Folks have other questions that you want to ask Sky, other comments that you want to make? I'd be curious if there was new stuff here, what folks who have lived in community for a while are taking away from what Sky said. So if anybody wants to comment on that, that would be great too. Communal moments.
Yeah, I was being given a cookie.
Aw. The benefits of living in community that rarely get talked about.
Yep.
Okay. Sky, is there anything that you didn't get a chance to expand on as much as you'd like to that you want to take a few more minutes on?
Oh, that's a good question.
Are there resources you want to recommend to folks?
Looking back over some of the stuff we've been working on lately. I mean, nothing particular coming to mind. I've kind of covered everything that I wanted to cover in here.
Okay, well, Daryl's popped up with another question, which is a group of us are forming an eco-village on the outskirts of Richmond, Virginia. We've had meetings with the local county. Currently, we are waiting for the county to create a zoning that would be suitable for an eco-village. Should we wait for the zoning or purchase the land and then apply for zoning changes? Great question.
Yeah, this is a great question. I mean, to some extent, the relative cooperativeness or malleability of your local officials, like you're going to know that better than I am, obviously. I mean, I think there is a thing here where it's a lot about relationships. There's a so anecdote and a little anecdote. There's a community that's trying to form in Charlottesville. Not too far away, an eco-village there. And one of the things that they ran into was around the access egress into the community, and that given the number of units they wanted to build on the property, and the lines of sight on the road, and the speed limit of the road was creating a much higher development need than they obviously wanted to for financial costs and impact and all of that. And so then one of the tacks that they were taking for a while was actually to work with one of the county board of supervisors who was into the idea of lowering speed limits, which if they could get the speed limit on that road lower, then it would reduce the requirements they had for the kinds of access point that they needed into the community. And so one of the people that was part of that group, did a significant bit of relationship building with this county board of supervisor thing to be able to encourage them to sort of champion that issue. So that's obviously one way of approaching it, I think. But I think in general that making yourself known in your local area. I mean, obviously that assumes that you're not trying to fly under the radar on anything, which is obviously an issue around sort of zoning stuff. But if you're trying to be totally above board, then I think being a good local citizen and developing relationships with your county officials can't hurt. Whether or not you should wait or not, yeah, it's a good question. I mean, again, it depends a little bit on your funding sources and what they're looking for. Wait for zoning or purchase the land and apply for zoning changes. Yeah. What are your funding sources? What are the, if you've got lenders, how quickly do you need to develop in order to be able to pay them back? And so purchasing it and then hoping for a zoning change might be questionable. So maybe you should go for the zoning changes first. I don't know. Yeah, there's a lot of potential ways of approaching this. Michael, you've looked at this stuff a lot. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, beyond what you've said, I think the thing that would be going through my mind if I was in that position was, if we go ahead and buy the land now, could we live with it if we didn't get everything that we're wanting, or should we actually go ahead and try to get changes through now, and then if they don't happen, then buy a different piece of land, somewhere that might be more amenable. So there's that. There's also Marty just popped up and said, I recommend mentioning Ms. Ludwig's, that's my current book, Together Resilient, and your upcoming Cooperative Culture Handbook, which should be relevant to all that was mentioned in this webinar. And the book that Marty's talking about, Together Resilient, I actually have a profile of Brandy Gallagher, who is at Our Eco Village in British Columbia. And I realize they're in Canada and not in the US, but Brandy's done a lot of thinking about how to approach these kinds of issues. And they actually have gotten zoning in British Columbia that now is a model template that's being used all over Canada and is starting to be picked up in some places in the US as well. So I would check out the work of Our Eco Village. It's OUR, and I can't remember what it stands for, but they're all capitalized, and you can Google them and Google Brandy, and she's a terrific resource. And as Marty mentions, there's a section in my book that talks about her work.
There's another little anecdote I'm remembering. Years ago, there's a group in Eugene, Oregon, Maitreya Eco Village, and one of the stories from there is that when they were building this sort of triplex of units on their 2-acre property in the city of Eugene, one of the tricks that they did is they negotiated with the city. They didn't want to build as many parking lots as the city would normally want them to build. And so they made a deal with the city where they would buy a certain number of bus passes each month in exchange for not having to build the parking spaces. And, Eugene was a pretty progressive city government, and so they went for it. Well, I'm not sure whether that's still happening or not, but it was sort of interesting, sort of creative problem solving on their part. And I know that was also a place where they were looking at actually getting the county or the city to create an eco-village ordinance. Again, so much of this stuff is local and state by state, but sometimes, at least in terms of the approach, you can look at different things. There's an organization in Oregon called Recode, and this is kind of their whole thing is looking at different zoning regulations, building codes, this sort of thing, and trying to create more ways for sustainable development to actually be legal, because it is very often not. So that again, going to be very different in terms of the actual laws, but in terms of the approach, there might be something to learn there.
Thanks. Okay, do folks have other questions for Skye? I put a quick note in the chat. Recode in Oregon is that organization that Skye was talking about. There's also the Sustainable Economies Law Center has done a lot of work around this stuff, so I'll toss their name in there. Here. Oh, Tim just popped in, Making Money Cooperatively. He wants to hear a little more about that.
Yeah, okay.
Let's just back to that for a second and then we'll close
Sure, yeah. Well, let's see. I mean, it is interesting. I mean, I do think the income sharing communities that have businesses are interesting ones to look at. So so Twin Oaks has its soy foods business and its hammocks business. One of its sort of offshoot communities from an Acorn community runs Southern Exposure Seed Exchange, which is a organic and heirloom variety seed business. Eastwind, another community in that network, has Eastwind Nut Butters, which is a highly successful nut butters business. So I mean, there's a lot to be learned from those communities around how to run businesses together and doing it in really cooperative ways. And part of what's really interesting about it, I think, is that in those kinds of contexts, you can't. There isn't the same hierarchy in place, so you can't fire people, which Certainly, sometimes some people wish they could, but that's not how it works in community. And so, all of a sudden, there are things that in traditional work environments don't matter as much that do matter, like particularly relationships, and the feelings of people involved. And so, how do you manage that? I think one of the key problems or dynamics that communities run into in general, but definitely comes up if there's community business involved, is there's the martyrs versus the slackers dynamic, and people tend to sort of filter themselves into one of those two categories, or just sort of hide in the middle somewhere. There's it's something that the people on both sides are responsible for, obviously, but this trick of how do we actually collectively take responsibility for this endeavor, and all contribute in a way that everyone feels good about. In the worker co-op world, they talk a lot about ownership culture. That's sort of the buzzword around that. Like, how do you foster that sense of ownership, that sense of responsibility, investment in the endeavor, so that everybody is feels good about the contributions that they're all making. Figuring out, obviously, if you're not in an income sharing community, being really clear about things like profit sharing agreements, and that sort of thing. I mean, this is where, again, sort of clarity and transparency in how finances are managed is super key. Working out, if you have an equities type situation, what the rules around that are, both in terms of building equity and payouts or buyouts. And then also, depending on the kind of business that you're running, if there is a wide range of skills involved, and especially if more kind of technically skilled work is required, then wage differential can become a big issue. And again, I mean, there are definitely, I would say more in the worker co-op world, there's some interesting examples out there about how to allow for a certain amount of wage differential for differing levels of skilled required for jobs, but doing it in a way that still feels equitable and fair to everyone involved. The Isthmus Engineering Cooperative in Wisconsin, as I know they've done some really good work around this, because they, as an engineering manufacturing cooperative, they definitely have a pretty big gap in some of the technical skills required, some of the education, that sort of thing people have put into being able to do the job they do, and have figured out some good ways around how to compensate that still feels fair, or that feels fair to everyone.
Okay, Sky, do you want to have the last word here and sum things up?
Yeah. What how do I want to sum this up? I mean, I think, what I said before, I guess I want to highlight is that, it's starting an intentional community, or, even joining an existing one. I mean, these are just such monumental endeavors that we're taking on, and we can't, the amount of work that it's going to take, what it's going to take from us, can't be overestimated. And I think keeping that in mind is important. And there's always going to be the times where it feels hopeless, and we got to just kind of keep going through that. And again, like I said, I mean, I definitely hold the philosophy that the only failure is the experience you don't learn from. So whether or not any particular initiative you're a part of succeeds or not, if you learn from it, if you can then take that learning on to whatever you're doing next, in some ways, that's the most important part involved.
Great. Okay. Everything feeling fair to everybody involved. That's a good overarching theme for community being functional. All right. Well, thank you so much, Sky, for imparting your wisdom on us today. And I appreciate everybody showing up and everybody who asked questions. And hopefully we'll see you next month at our next monthly webinar. Thanks so much for being here, everybody.